Something surprising just appeared on the court docket involving Blake Lively, and the timing could not be more intense. A brand new filing was submitted right before a potentially major ruling in the legal dispute connected to It Ends With Us. But here's the twist: many legal observers say the argument inside that filing might not apply the way it claims to. So what exactly is happening behind the scenes, and why did this show up right now? The conversation around the film adaptation of It Ends With Us has always centered on empowerment and emotional storytelling, and of course that matters, but what many people overlook is something deeper, something more layered. The story is filled with every shade of human emotion: joy, hope, humor, pain, heartbreak, and complicated relationships, and that emotional complexity is exactly what drew audiences in, especially to the character Lily portrayed by Blake Lively. But now the conversation surrounding the project has taken a surprising turn because something unusual just appeared on the court docket, and it is raising serious questions about what might be happening behind the scenes of the legal dispute connected to the film. And the timing could not be more interesting because only recently the judge overseeing the case pushed the deadline for pretrial motions forward by a week, which immediately sparked speculation among observers that a major ruling could be approaching, and that is exactly when a new filing arrived from Lively's legal team, a document meant to notify the court about a recent appellate decision involving a case called Miller v. LaManna, and according to the filing, the legal team suggests that the ruling in Miller should lead the judge to deny the defendant's motion for judgment on the pleadings. But the moment legal watchers started reading the details, many began to notice something important. The Miller decision was about a very specific procedural issue. In that case, the district court had evaluated a claim only through the lens of the original complaint rather than reviewing the full evidence gathered during discovery, and the appellate court said that approach was not correct because once discovery has been completed, judges should review the entire evidentiary record instead of focusing only on the pleadings. But here is where things become complicated, because the procedural situation in the current dispute involving Lively appears to be quite different, and that difference is at the center of the growing debate among those following the case closely. To understand why this matters, it helps to look at the types of motions involved, because in federal litigation the difference between a motion to dismiss, a motion for judgment on the pleadings, and a motion for summary judgment can shape the entire direction of a case, and that distinction is exactly what observers are now discussing. The Miller case dealt with a situation where the court essentially treated a summary judgment motion as if it were a motion to dismiss, and in doing so it ignored the evidence collected during discovery, which the appellate court said was procedural error. But the dispute involving Lively involves two separate motions: a motion for judgment on the pleadings and a motion for summary judgment, which means the judge has options on how to proceed. A motion for judgment on the pleadings typically asks a narrow question whether the legal claims described in the complaint and the responses actually state a valid claim under the law, and when courts evaluate this type of motion, they can review the pleadings and documents incorporated into them, such as contracts, offer letters, or written agreements that are referenced within the filings. And according to filings discussed by legal commentators, some documents were attached as exhibits, including contractual material and related correspondence, and that means the judge is allowed to consider those materials while reviewing the motion. The key point, however, is that this type of motion does not necessarily require the judge to evaluate the entire discovery record unless the court decides to convert the motion into summary judgment under a separate rule, and that distinction is why some legal analysts believe the Miller precedent may not align perfectly with the situation currently unfolding in the Lively case, because the Miller decision focused on a judge disregarding evidence while ruling on summary judgment, whereas the current procedural posture may involve the judge simply deciding a different motion entirely. As the debate continues, many observers are paying close attention to how the judge might interpret the relevance of the Miller decision, because appellate rulings can influence legal arguments, but they do not automatically dictate the outcome of every case. Judges still have the discretion to determine whether a precedent truly applies to the facts before them, and this is where the suspense surrounding the docket activity begins to build. Because if the judge concludes that the Miller case is distinguishable, then the court could continue evaluating the motion for judgment on the pleadings independently, while also considering the separate motion for summary judgment that is already pending, and that possibility creates a range of potential outcomes. Some outcomes could narrow the claims involved in the dispute, while others could allow the litigation to move forward toward trial. Another element that has attracted attention is the broader discussion about how certain claims are structured in federal cases, because sometimes plaintiffs assert similar claims under both federal and state law, and courts occasionally examine whether those claims overlap too heavily. When identical legal theories are presented in multiple forms, federal courts sometimes streamline the case to avoid duplicative claims, especially when the same relief can be obtained through one statute rather than several, and this is why some legal commentators believe the judge may analyze whether the claims at issue overlap with existing federal remedies, such as those under employment discrimination statutes, including Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is frequently referenced in federal workplace litigation. And although every case is unique, courts generally aim to ensure that claims proceed under the most appropriate legal framework while avoiding unnecessary duplication. All of this leads to the question that has captured the attention of those following the case: what exactly will the judge decide when the time comes to rule? And while no one outside the courtroom can predict the outcome, the timing of the filing has certainly intensified the speculation, because the notice referencing the Miller decision arrived just as the court's extended deadline created expectations that a ruling might soon appear. And when filings like this emerge shortly before a potential decision, they often signal that the legal teams are carefully positioning their arguments in advance of the court's analysis. That does not necessarily indicate how the judge will rule, but it does show how closely each side is watching the procedural details of the case. The next step will depend on how the court interprets the interaction between the pleadings, the evidence, and the applicable legal standards, and whether the appellate decision cited in the filing truly affects the motion currently before the court. Until that ruling arrives, the discussion surrounding the case continues to grow, particularly among audiences who followed the development of the It Ends With Us film adaptation and the broader entertainment industry conversation involving figures like Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. And for now, the docket entry has added another layer of intrigue to an already closely watched legal situation. In the end, the most important thing to remember is that court filings often represent strategic arguments rather than final decisions, and the judge will ultimately determine how much weight each argument carries when evaluating the motions currently before the court. The reference to the Miller case may or may not influence that analysis, but its appearance on the docket has clearly intensified interest in the next stage of the proceedings. What happens next will depend on how the court interprets the procedural rules and whether the pleadings and evidence satisfy the standards required for the case to continue forward until the judge issues a ruling. The situation remains a developing legal story, and for viewers who have been following every update, the coming decision could reveal which direction the case will take next. As this situation continues to unfold, one thing becomes very clear: the story surrounding the legal dispute connected to the film adaptation of It Ends With Us is far from finished. What began as a discussion about storytelling, emotional depth, and the impact of bringing a beloved novel to the big screen has now expanded into a complicated legal narrative that many viewers and industry observers are watching closely. The recent filing from the legal team representing Blake Lively has added another layer to that narrative, and it has sparked a wave of discussion about how the court might interpret the arguments presented. In the world of litigation, filings like this are often strategic moves designed to highlight particular legal precedents or interpretations that one side believes could influence the outcome. That does not automatically mean the court will agree, but it does reveal how carefully each side is positioning their arguments as the case moves toward a potential decision. What makes this moment especially interesting is the timing. The judge recently extended the deadline for pretrial motions, which immediately led many legal watchers to speculate that a ruling on one or more pending motions could be approaching. When a filing referencing a new appellate case appears during that window, it naturally raises questions about whether the legal teams are anticipating an imminent decision. Sometimes these filings are simply a way of making sure the court is aware of recent developments in case law. Other times they are an effort to shape the legal framework the judge might use when reviewing the motions. Regardless of the motivation, the document has clearly intensified interest in what the court will do next. At the center of the debate is the difference between several types of legal motions and how they interact with the evidence gathered during discovery. The Miller case cited in the filing focused on a procedural issue involving how a court evaluated claims after discovery had already produced a record of evidence. But in the dispute currently being discussed, the judge is reviewing separate motions, including a motion for judgment on the pleadings and a motion for summary judgment. Because those motions operate under different standards, the judge has discretion to determine how each one should be analyzed. That discretion is a key element of federal court procedure, and it is why legal observers are emphasizing that precedent alone does not automatically determine the outcome of a new case. Another aspect that has drawn attention is how courts handle claims that overlap under different statutes. Federal courts sometimes examine whether similar claims brought under both state and federal law are duplicative, especially when they arise from the same underlying facts. In many cases, judges will streamline the claims to focus on the most appropriate legal framework. That does not necessarily decide the case, but it can shape how the litigation moves forward. These types of procedural questions may seem technical, yet they often have a major impact on how a case develops and what issues ultimately reach a jury. For viewers who have been following the journey of this project from its origins as a best-selling novel to its transformation into a major film production, the legal developments add a completely different dimension to the conversation. The public interest surrounding the story has always been strong, in part because of the popularity of the original book and the high-profile cast involved in bringing the characters to life on screen. Now the courtroom developments are creating a parallel narrative that many people are trying to understand step by step. What happens next will depend entirely on how the judge evaluates the pending motions and whether the arguments raised in the recent filing are considered persuasive in this specific procedural context. Courts regularly review similar disputes, and each decision depends on the details of the case before them. Until a ruling is issued, everything remains in the realm of legal argument and interpretation rather than final judgment. So for now, this remains a developing story, and the next update could arrive at any moment once the court releases its decision. When that happens, it will likely clarify which arguments carried the most weight and how the case will proceed from here. Whether the ruling narrows the claims, allows the litigation to continue, or leads to further legal challenges, it will certainly shape the next chapter of this already closely watched dispute. And as always, the most important thing is to follow the developments, carefully examine the documents, and let the legal process reveal where the story ultimately goes.